Yeah, thanks again, Christian, and thanks to the everyone at the UK Biochar Research Centre for hosting this webinar, having us today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about classifying carbon dioxide removals and looking at distributing the corresponding removal credits using Web3 technology, which is commonly known as blockchain ledgering technology. I work for company Standard Gas, and we've established a subsidiary called Carbon Char, which is working this project. So this presentation builds on my boss's presentation from last year. Richard spoke about biochar from waste and its practical considerations, talking about the economics of it. And if you find any of this interesting, I urge you to go and look at that. What Richard talked about is basically what's driving the business at the moment and is still very, very relevant. And so in that presentation, he goes into some details about what it is Standard Gas does, the business and the technology that it has. So this presentation will be some light on that information, but this presentation will focus on the climate mitigation potentials of carbon dioxide removals from mixed waste, typically municipal solid waste or RDF, which is considered refuse-derived fuel. We at Carbon Char, we're looking at what we've done to classify our carbon dioxide removals due to the variety of the waste that we process and the pathways that we use to produce negative emissions using biochar. And what we've found is that this is actually suitable for carbon dioxide removal projects of all kinds. And so part of the work that we're doing at Carbon Char is looking to see if we can establish a marketplace for all kinds of carbon dioxide removals. And hopefully using blockchain and Web3 technology, we can reduce the barriers to entry for that market and accelerate the negative emissions that are necessary to meet IPCC global warming pathways. So just briefly, the Standard Gas technology is a primary plant. It's called the SG100. It's currently under construction. It's due to be operating Q1 23. It takes, as I mentioned, a solid waste, municipal solid waste, and processes about 48,000 tons a year. Looking at the life cycle of the emissions, we expect to have in the region of 8,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent removals. And as I said, Carbon Char is the side of the business that has been set up to see what to do with that. So as I said, Carbon Char is the project that's leading this, and it's set up Standard Gas. We're looking at incorporating the biochar, the biogenic fraction of the carbon that ends up in our char, in several sequestration pathways. The primary one we're exploring is looking at commingling it in concrete and hopefully being able to sequester that carbon for several hundred years. Now, in order to sell and market those carbon dioxide removals, we've been looking to get accredited, and I'll talk about the carbon credit market here just a little bit. So currently it's very much a discrete market. There are several organizations that offer removals, each with their own benchmarks and each with their own prices and products. They obviously they vary in permanence of different removals from such projects, from anywhere from 50 to over 10,000 years. But fundamentally, carbon dioxide removal have characteristics that should be easily comparable. Now, the problem that Standard Gas has was that there was not a methodology to account for the emission reductions and removals from mixed waste pyrolysis and the biogenic fraction of that waste that ended up in char. which is obviously a carbon removal. And it was going to be in the region of £250,000 for us to go ahead with developing a methodology for work that we would ultimately be doing anyway. And so we thought that we could possibly come up with a system that could address that. So we identified 6 criteria that define all carbon dioxide removals. We have a variety of removals based, as I mentioned, on the different waste feedstocks that we have, but also the routes, the pathways that sequestered carbon goes through after it's once it's a biochar. And those 6 criteria are listed here. The mass of the biogenic carbon dioxide equivalent and any scientific certainty that may go with that. The second being the removal process and the corresponding emissions. The stability of the sequestrate, whether that's wood, biochar, liquefied CO2, whatever, or even in the case of geological storage, what that carbon, what form it takes. The longevity of that sequestration mode obviously vary, and part of that is due to the stewardship, the 5th criteria, and the risks in the changes of circumstance of that steward. I think the most prominent example being a forest, and whether or not that is circumstances change with regards to the use of that land. And finally, we take a stance on novelty and additionality. And it should be noted that in this criteria to be classified for carbon dioxide removals, that there are certain boundaries that you have to meet, particularly around additionality, and that the process of carbon dioxide removal does not take place it's not legally required to take place. So these 6 criteria then each have their corresponding weighting, which then results in a score, AAA to D we've selected. And as you can imagine, the AAA rating would have a more permanent, secure, and a novel technology, and you could be more certain about the removal claims it was making. We expect this to correspond with that of direct air capture and geological storage, as we believe that's probably the best in class at the moment for carbon dioxide removals. And the D rating corresponding to something far less permanent, so that of wood, possibly in the use of sustainable building materials or in furniture, but still has value as a carbon credit nonetheless. And it was for this range and quality of removal that it was quite suitable for us for biochar to sit somewhere in the middle. And as I said, we would expect to have a varying resulting carbon credit based on the different pathways that we're exploring. Now, each project would be audited annually for its year of removal data to ensure it continues to be legitimate, and a project could provide more third-party verification if it looked to increase the claims or increase the security of the claims it was making. And I think in this instance, a lot to align with the International Standard Organization philosophy around carbon accounting, if there are any uncertainties, a conservative view would be taken, and where data is unavailable, credits would obviously be revoked. Fundamentally, the goal here is to produce a criteria which all carbon dioxide removals can use to be rated and therefore compared against one another. And this is in line with the IPCC's reminder, again in February this year, that we need to drive reduction in emissions as soon as possible, but also to scale carbon dioxide removal technology. So by creating a classification for these carbon dioxide removals, both for our own and other projects, we hope to facilitate the comparison, of removals and produce a continuous market, continuous data spread in that market, allowing consumers and businesses to make better informed decisions based on the removal data that will be available to see. And each of those criteria will be on the credit, each with its own information and indelibly and uniquely stamped in that. This, we hope, will allow for the ease of entry onto the removals market, whereby projects see the large barriers to entry as we've experienced. And this comes back to trying to increase the amount of removals available for companies and individuals to purchase. By sharing this information, one can make an assessment on the value of that removal. AAA, obviously, we expect to be in line with some of the more expensive permanent removals at the moment, and D at the lower end of that. But those removals that are rated in the middle, we will hope to have a floating market, which will allow for all of the demand to meet the supply. Fundamentally, the goal here overall is to drive demand for removals and allow suppliers to produce more of them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we might use Web3 technology, which is typically that of cryptographic assets and blockchain. It's quite a lot of jargon, so please feel free to question us afterwards, but I'll try and keep it as light as possible. But fundamentally, we feel that the classified removals complement the qualities that blockchain and NFTs, for example, have, in that they are unique and they are automated, indelible, and transparent, which allows for reduction in the governing costs, which is often tied up with the barriers to entry for the supply of carbon dioxide removals. Non-fungible tokens we've identified as a potential means of certifying carbon credits once they've been classified and once they've been rated. The metadata that is incorporated in that rating will then be indelibly stamped onto an NFT and would be available for everyone to see. Moreover, we'd put in that information who the NFT was issued to, so it therefore couldn't be double counted, and that it can be further traded, avoiding double counting and potentially fraud. We'd hope that the NFTs are minted as the information for the classification comes in and is validated and is assigned a rating. That ledger, the blockchain ledger, then supports a secure system which records transactions of carbon credits on a peer-to-peer network. And again, this reduces security costs, avoiding double counting fraud. The automated system, as I said, there isn't expensive once it's been established, and it's decentralized, so it doesn't require resources from a third party to oversee it. And the blueprints for that blockchain system would be publicly available so that it could be inspected along with the contents of those NFTs, so that it could be it's transparent and there's no funny business taking place behind the scenes. Now, what we believe this might enable to happen in the carbon dioxide removals market is that by classifying and then producing these carbon credits on a blockchain system in the form of NFTs, we would be able to create a one-stop sort of marketplace for those removals. The classification would ensure that they are all legitimate. The blockchain system would ensure that they are all unique and that they are not double counted. And fundamentally, the information and data is available for all to see to make more informed decisions about the removals themselves, and to see what they can do with their budget for removals and mitigation, whether it's longer, more permanent removals with greater cost, or a shorter term approach, which would then be revisited in the future. Ultimately, we'd like to have a floating price depending on the supply of removals, and this hopefully will demonstrate to suppliers as the demand fills that supply that there is a great demand for these removals, and that will de-risk projects, helping them to bring more removals online. Finally, we've got the forward selling of carbon removal credits is something that takes place at the moment with Climeworks is a project that does this, and it's we feel it might be an opportunity to de-risk and bring online more projects that that otherwise would not get the funding, raise the capital necessary to begin their operations. All in all, the goal of this system would be to verify and validate the removals, make it open and transparent for people to inspect and to see what that removal is, how long it's going to be around for in the academic, and the data necessary to back that claim up. And we hope that by reducing the transaction costs and the barriers to entry for carbon dioxide removal projects, that we can accelerate the speed at which these removals are able to come online, and money and the demand for the removals is able to scale the technology that will ultimately help us mitigate catastrophic climate change, reaching a global net zero. So that's the project in its entirety. That's what Carbon Char Store is working on, and we hope to have a beta system for this operating in the next 6 months. We'd be keen to get initial feedback on that. We're looking at classifying some removals at the moment, and then seeing, as I said, establishing a beta system to see how it would work in practice and whether or not there's an appetite for it. So thank you very much for your time. I understand I raced through that, and I think we've got plenty of time now for questions, which I'm welcome to take.
Great. Thank you very much, Oliver. And I think you already got a starting question from John, which was, please clarify the immutability of a blockchain entry with change of circumstance requiring revocation of the NFT. So how would you revoke a removal if it's in the blockchain?
So we, to begin with, we would only issue removal credits for projects that have removed carbon in the past. So that's not so much of an issue, as you can take into account the emissions accounting, look at the corresponding information that supports that accounting, and then you can assess the project itself. We would expect projects coming on board to have a third-party support of that project, and what that would mean is that it avoids that risk. Where the issue lies with regards to revoking a carbon credit that was not legitimate is where you would issue a forward contract to provide a carbon removal credit. So as I said, yeah, it's not so much if it's happened, we can make an assessment on that based on seeing it physically take place and the corresponding evidence to support that. But it's where you're forward selling future removals that becomes slightly more technical.
If there's any follow-up question, John, please write in the chat or just ask directly. I was wondering I think the waste treatment is currently not in the ETS system. In the European, what happens if it is? So if you have your voluntary system next to a national system, because
yeah, so that's you're absolutely right there. So the EU ETS, if that or the United Kingdom's version of it, if that was to come online, then a decision would be made as to whether or not, that there wouldn't be scope to run the voluntary carbon removals alongside that. But what we might see is that where waste is not used as a feedstock, but rather you would acquire whether feedstock that isn't waste, for example, forestry or wood, then that would be an opportunity to continue that voluntary carbon project. Now, obviously, what we're talking about with our system, we hope will be suitable for other removals, and that would be we hope would still be a suitable marketplace for those. Managing waste, incorporating that into the ETS scheme would not be, would be double counting, as you know, so we wouldn't take those.
Thank you. Paul raised his hand.
Yes. My question is about the status of the work and what point it is. It's a grand plan. I like it a lot. The things are in there, all the right. You said that 6 months. The one date that you mentioned was like 6 months from now. There's something on. Can you give us a statement as to how far you are along with this process, and to what extent do you deal with others working with you, or is it just an in-house operation?
So we have created a draft classification system. It's quite a heavy document, and we're now looking to the 6 criteria that we've come up with. We are looking to weight those to then correspond those to the overall grading. Now, what we're doing is we're fine-tuning that using current examples of carbon dioxide removals. And once we've weighted those 6 criteria, we'd like to think we've then got the first classification that we might be able to use to then rate removals of all kinds. So that's very much in the works, and that hypothetical work has taken place. Now deploying a system, a blockchain system, and building that out that would then correspond to the classification system we've made, that will be in its initial phase. Hopefully we're looking at the end of this year, but that wouldn't be ready for market for, I would expect, 12 to 18 months. Once we've familiarized ourselves with a blockchain ledgering system that we feel is appropriate and meets the sort of the ethical and open, transparent qualities that we'd need for it to have legs. So please, if you've got a carbon removal and you'd like it to be rated using our classification system, then we can sit down and run through it with you, and we can see what kind of grading it would get and whether or not that might be something you'd expect to see. And then that would be a helpful exercise for us to then continue the classification work that we've done.
That's good. I mean, you're looking for other components coming in. So I'm going to change my question a little bit. Assuming that there is a product out there, someone producing a carbon removal, and it gets a AA rating.
Yeah.
And there's something else out there which is getting we'll go with a B rating. We won't go to D. We'll just go to B or C. All right.
Yeah.
Each one of those is saying it's on a basis of a per ton of CO2 removal. And how do you put the price tag on it? Because AA, not AAA, I mean, just any of these different variations, is this weighting system also going to affect what the real market price should be? Or do people just continue to go off and buy the cheapest stuff they can and say, hey, I bought 3 tons, and they don't care what it is?
So we would hope that the rating would therefore, as you said, correspond exactly with the price. And that's because you can see the permanence that affects the rating. So you're absolutely right, but we'd also hope that we can establish a floating system whereby bids are put in for different permanents or different rated carbon removals, and that's reflected in a greater demand and therefore a greater price for the higher rated removals. Now, how the marketplace would work in practice is that the suppliers of those removals would probably set a minimum price that they'd be willing to sell at, and then we would therefore use that as a benchmark in a bidding process so that any excess supplied removals could be bid for by customers and by businesses that want to get hold of them. Does that answer your question?
Yes, but a company that says we bought 50 tons or 5,000 tons of AAs and somebody else says, I bought 5,000 tons of seed. So they paid a different price. That's what they put on their website, that they bought 50,000 tons. We have to educate the world to be somehow or other appreciative that there are differences in these.
Absolutely, and it must be noted that if you do not go for the most permanent form of carbon removal, then it must be revisited, and that's what we hope will be apparent when the information and the data that makes up these credits is available for all to see. But yes, you're absolutely right there, and that's going to be part of the journey to teach the use of these carbon credits as part of the environmental mitigation sort of itinerary.
After the question sessions, would you please put your email address, contact information into the chat? Then we can all have it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have two questions I also want to go through before the second presentation. So Wihan asked, who would you consider as third-party verifiers, and what scale is required to justify their fees?
So we would hope that any project that is looking to gain a carbon removal credit has a partner that it sits with, a third-party partner. We have one ourselves, an environmental consultant, and for a considerably smaller fee, they will validate to some degree what we do and our carbon accounting based on the information that we show them, much like an auditor or now we would the fees we're trying to avoid here is producing another methodology. So another methodology to accounting for removals, and that is we've come up against has been very expensive. But we believe that by demonstrating using ISO accredited accountants, as it were, carbon accountants, that they would be able to demonstrate what you're saying, your claims are real. So that's how we would expect them to be sort of ISO accredited, but also have some environmental credentials themselves, without having to establish a whole new methodology if the technology that you are looking to remove carbon with is nascent and is unfamiliar to the market. And
the last question from Rocky is, how much energy is used for the blockchain?
That's a really good question. And in developing the blockchain, that was the environmental credentials of the blockchain ledgering system was the first question that we were asked. So obviously, I know for those of you familiar with Bitcoin and Ethereum, they work on what's called I believe a proof of stake system, which is a highly energy intensive method of securing transactions. Proof of work, thank you, Wuhan. So current Ethereum and Bitcoin use proof of work, but we would hope that proof of stake is another method of securing those transactions, which uses a much smaller fraction of energy. The blockchain we're producing, as I said, will have a white paper that's currently being drafted, and that will be open for the public to see and to feedback on before the blockchain system is developed. I believe the token we'd align ourselves with is Binance, but that is still to be determined. We welcome any thoughts on that. Thanks, Will.
And just a really quick last question. So, because there's a lot of permanence discussion about CDR removal markets and how to rate that. So, do you think there's a benefit in having a 2,000 or 1,000 year removal permanence or a 100-year permanence?
So, my view is, and I think this is the view of the team here, is that all removals have value at the moment. But they're not all the same. And so we've got two issues. That's one, to scale the long-term permanent carbon sequestration pathways that are required to remove historic industrial emissions, well into the future post 2050, once we're hopefully net zero as a globe. But in the meantime, to mitigate the amount of emissions that we'll have to scrub in the future, I think scaling small scale, less permanent removals is also vital, and that's what we think is important. And that's where I think many of the technologies that incorporate biochar probably sit, in that, yes, they aren't as permanent as geological carbon capture and storage, but they certainly do play a role in sequestering carbon for several hundred years, and also having their separate co-benefits. The technology that Standard Gas deploys has a huge environmental improvement on what already happens to municipal solid waste, which is incineration and landfill. And so incorporating those co-benefits as well is quite important to keep in mind when considering your environmental footprint. So hope that.
And that was also nicely put Standard Gas back into the focus. So thanks a lot, Oliver, for your talk.